It will never cease to impress me how relevant Bionicle continues to be to this very day. You'd expect an over 20-year-old franchise, which original run ended over a decade ago, and which hasn't gotten any substantial content for the past 7 years, would have faded into obscurity, but that's not the case. If anything, it feels like the opposite. Bionicle feels more relevant today than it ever has since the series first ended in 2010. The series is brought up surprisingly often across various online spaces, with people fondly reminiscing about the series whether it's for the toys, the story, or just general childhood nostalgia. But perhaps more surprisingly, the series has managed to cultivate a dedicated fanbase that's active to this day. We live in a day and age where fandoms come and go due to how our current online culture revolves so much around chasing the hot new thing rather than forming lasting communities. Not to mention how much new content is released these days that many stories fail to sustain a fanbase to begin with. As such, it's really refreshing to see a fandom for a long finished and outdated series to thrive for decades. Not really caring about the passage of time or increasing irrelevancy of the series as the company has long since moved on. The Bionicle fandom consists of hundreds, if not thousands of passionate fans who love the series to death, cherish it by having in-depth discussion of it, and producing all kinds of high-quality fan content. It's come to the point that the fanbase has started to organize the Bionicle Day, an unofficial fandom holiday where fans gather together to celebrate their beloved series and to showcase various fan works across the community, proving how at this point the fanbase basically functions on its own, without any authority figure, whether that being the creators of the series or Lego itself. And one such fan is me. I've been a huge fan of Bionicle ever since I was a child, and continue to be one to this very day. This series is one of the most formative pieces of fiction for me, as it helps to shape a lot of my tastes in media for years to come. Without it, there is a good chance that I would have a very different selection of favorite stories than I do now. But outside of nostalgia and how much it helped to shape my preferences, Bionicle is a genuinely great story on its own right. Its deep world-building, captivating mysteries, and a likable cast of characters make it a story that's worth revisiting as an adult all these years later. Sure, the series is far from perfect, then again, what story is, but its strengths outweigh its flaws in my eyes, making it easily one of my favorite stories of all time. So on this Bionicle Day, I wanted to join in the festivities and give something back to this franchise that means so much to me. And given how it's the 20th anniversary, I figured what better way to join the fun than to analyze the first Bionicle movie, Mask of Light. There couldn't be a more fitting topic. You see, Mask of Light was the thing that made me a Bionicle fan. While I liked the series before it, the movie was that got me so deeply immersed into the world and the character. It was also one of my favorite movies as a kid, alongside the likes of Treasure Planet and Captain Returns. And when I say favorite movie, I do not mean that in a healthy way. Oh no. I mean, I was obsessed with this movie growing up. I remember there being at least a few days when I did nothing but watch this movie over and over again. I was that enthralled with this movie. Suffice it to say, I'm certainly qualified in this section of this movie. Even if my present self isn't nearly as devoted to this movie as I was in elementary school. Trust me, I have other media that occupy that spot these days. Truth to be told, I haven't actually revisited this movie in years in spite of my nostalgic fondness to it and how often I do revisit Bionicle as a whole. It would be an interesting look to take a look at this movie from an actual perspective. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to see how well this movie holds up and to figure out what made it special to begin with. So I'm the Arcanist, and without any further ado, join me, my gather friends, as we take a look into the legacy of Mask of Light. Well, we aren't going to analyze the movie just yet. Before I start talking about Mask of Light proper, I want to take a quick detour to briefly discuss the making of the movie, partially out of obligation, It seems to be almost mandatory for these large retrospective style video essay analysis videos to talk about how whatever story they're analyzing was made before, well, actually analyzing the story. But that's not the only reason I want to talk about the making of this movie, as not only do I find the making of Mask of Light to be a genuinely fascinating look behind the curtain on how the movie was made, it will also play a role in my larger overarching thesis surrounding the movie. For now, let's just put a pin on that and go over the making of Mask of Light. It is largely known that Mask of Light was not only the first Bionicle movie, but also the first movie based on a LEGO property. What may be less known is that the development of Mask of Light goes far further than we may think, as the idea of a potential movie tie-in was suggested as early as 2001. When the series proved to be popular with the kids to the point film companies were knocking at LEGO's door for permission to get licensed to make a movie, LEGO decided to give the Bionicle movie a shot. As they wanted to keep the full creative control, LEGO refused the licensing requests by other parties, instead deciding to find a potential partner to help them develop the movie while still keeping a full creative control. The search for this partner was easier said than done, as many of the potential candidates had some rather interesting ideas on what a Bionicle movie should look like. One of the more common suggestions was for the movie to star a human child who got transported into the world of Bionicle and adventured in the island of Metanui. These ideas were rejected, as many members of Bionicle's story team were opposed to the idea of humans being present in Bionicle's narrative in any way, shape, or form, as they felt it would break the illusion of Bionicle's world feeling like a real tangible setting, just one separate from our own. This led to LEGO having a hard time in finding a potential partner, due to how many partner candidates were insistent in adding a human character to make the movie more marketable and relatable to the kids. Eventually, after rejecting many potential partners, LEGO had narrowed their choices down to 3 companies. One of them was Creative Capers Entertainment, an American animation studio specializing in computer and hand-drawn animation for various feature films, television series, commercials, and video games. Founded by the husband and wife duo Terry and Sue Shakespeare alongside David Molina, Creative Capers mostly worked on outsourced material for bigger studios, with their most notable work at this point being on additional animation for Disney Renaissance movies such as Beauty and the Beast or The Lion King, as well as being the main studio on season 1 of the cartoon Sitting Ducks. Being mostly a studio that worked under bigger studios and having a pretty impressive resume on works they helped to develop on, Creative Capers was a nearly perfect fit for LEGO to work on a Bionicle movie. They still had to prove themselves to be the right choice, however, and thus they, along with the other 2 candidates, Elliott Animation and Blur Studios, were tasked to make a test animation within the Bionicle universe to show their skills. Creative Capers' test animation featuring a giant Liva Mata impressed LEGO so much they decided hiring the studio as their partner was a no-brainer. After the studio was chosen, Mask of Light's production began in earnest in 2002. Terry Shakespeare and David Molina served as the directors, where Sue Shakespeare served as the movie's main producer. As for the writers, well, that's an interesting story in and of itself. The leader of the series' story team, Bob Thompson, acted as the consultant of the story and helped developing it alongside Alistair Swinnerton, another notable member of Bionicle's original story team. But what's more interesting are the 2 writers outside of the story team who were hired to the movie specifically. Believe it or not, one of the writers hired to work on Mask of Light was the notable TV show writer and showrunner Greg Weisman. Yes, that Greg Weisman, of the Gargoyles and Spectacular Spider-Man fame. Due to creative differences, however, Weisman left early in the movie's development, stating afterwards how he developed somewhat sour feelings for the franchise due to his experience with the movie. Weisman still managed to contribute to the movie and thus was credited in spite of his early departure. The other outsider writer was Henry Gilroy, best known for being the co-writer of Star Wars The Clone Wars, who got involved with the project after having a meeting with Bob Thompson. There, Gilroy showed genuine enthusiasm for the Bionicle franchise and its mythos. This made it clear for Thompson how much Gilroy wanted to work on the series, which led to him being hired as one of the writers for Mask of Light. After Gilroy was hired, Gilroy and Swinnerton had a competition where they both created a draft script. Whoever wrote the better draft would end up being the blueprint for the movie itself.
Gilroy's script ended up being chosen. However, the finished script would end up including some ideas from Swinnerton's draft. Gilroy then wrote 8 different drafts for the script before setting up on the final version, which is apparently less than usual compared to the other projects Gilroy has worked on. The biggest challenge for Gilroy was to write a Toa, as he had to take account how Thompson interpreted the characters, not to mention the many fans the series already had. Another challenge for Gilroy was to balance the screen time of the 6 Toa, and to make sure that no Toa would end up overshadowing the others in terms of importance. Gilroy was also told to avoid pop culture references as much as possible, and instead to use idioms and terminology specifically created for the setting.
Holy head! You could have been lava bump.
In the end, Gilroy ended up creating a script he was satisfied with, as he felt he successfully managed to stay true to the characters, while also giving the voice actors something unique to work with. As far as the visual representation for the characters go, the team of creative capers decided to use CGI commercials by Ghost as a basis for their visual style. Initially, the team wasn't going to change the character designs all that much, but they changed their minds after realizing how they needed the characters to clearly express their emotions, hence the inclusion of the eyebrows and the mouth. The character designs were also given muscles to their shoulders, calves, abdomen, and chest cavity in order to give the much needed texture to their bodies. The organ design stayed mostly the same, just with slightly more detail. One interesting note of the designs is how some of them were actually created by the movie team themselves, with some assistance from LEGO of course. By far the biggest example of this is Makuta, whose design was created by taking parts and pieces from other Bionicle sets to create the ultimate Bionicle villain. Another notable aspect of the movie's creation was the audio. The casting was managed by Chris Zimmerman. Probably the most well-known story of the casting process was the casting of the 2 main characters, Takua and Jeller, as originally their voice actors were auditioning for different roles. The serious and stubborn Andre Francis was auditioning for the goofy Takua, while Jasmine Case was auditioning for Jeller. In the auditioning process, the 2 were told to voice their opposing roles, which worked really well. Another notable aspect of the movie's audio was its soundtrack by the legendary composer Nathan Frost. Frost was apparently hired by his dentist, as his dentist had contact with people working on the movie and decided to recommend Frost's work for them. That's pretty much an example of knowing your connections. After 1.5 years of development, Mask of Light was released on direct-to-video and DVD on September 13th. Mask of Light begins with our protagonist, Takua, fighting a strange mask while exploring one of Takoro's caves. After accidentally showing the mask to the residents of Island of Matanui, it's revealed that the mask is the legendary Kanohi Mask of Light belonging to the 7th Toa. A Toa of Light prophesies to defeat the evil Makuta and awaken Matanui. As the discoverer of the mask, Takua is forced to go on the journey to find the 7th Toa and retrieve the mask to its rightful owner. Hesitant to accept his responsibility, however, Takua decides to put this burden onto his best friend Jeller, who drags the reluctant Takua as his companion. Takua and Jeller then travel across the island of Matanui searching for the 7th Toa. All meanwhile, Makuta tries to prevent the 2 from completing their task by sending his most powerful minions, the Rakshi, after them. What follows is a journey of self-discovery, featuring cameos by your favorite characters and a hefty dose of trauma both for the main duo and those around them. As a movie, Mask of Light is a fantasy movie aimed at a family audience. The movie has all the tropes associated with a typical fantasy adventure: a journey which involves a MacGuffin, a chosen one that has to defeat the evil Dark Lord, said Dark Lord sending his minions to prevent the chosen one from defeating him, and so on. What makes Mask of Light interesting is how it chooses to execute those tropes. While some of them, like the evil Dark Lord, are played relatively straight, other tropes are played far more, such as the chosen one and the MacGuffin. While the movie centers around the title Mask of Light as its central MacGuffin, it acts as the central catalyst of the journey of finding the 7th Toa rather than acting as the object or heroes try to find in the first place. Instead, Mask of Light serves the means of which our heroes use to navigate towards the Toa of Light, reversing the usual Chosen One MacGuffin dynamic. The MacGuffin is the key to the Chosen One, rather than the Chosen One being the one destined to find the MacGuffin to save the world. Another way Mask of Light subverts genre conventions is how it doesn't really focus on the Toa. You'd expect a movie based on a Toa line would focus on the heroes it advertises, but that is really the case. While the Toa play a notable role in the movie by having their own subplot and getting chances to show their skills in the movie's many action scenes, the movie isn't really interested in being about them. Instead, the movie is centered around the two Matoran, Taku and Jeller, and their quest in finding the seventh Toa. A good portion of the movie is focused on the two traveling across the island while encountering familiar faces and danger along the way. In that sense, the movie feels a lot like a condensed road trip movie. And just like any good road trip movie, Mask of Light uses its framing as a means to explore the mental places of its main characters and as a way to let them develop. It isn't anything too deep or profound. This is a kids movie meant to advertise a toy brand after all, but it's still well done. The journey to the seventh Toa serves as a means to concretize Takua's inner journey of coming to his own, and if anything, helps to make this journey of self-discovery digestible to its general audience. By tying the external arc of finding the seventh Toa into Takua's internal arc, the movie is capable of making this easier to understand for a younger audience who maybe wouldn't understand this kind of arc otherwise. And another notable way Mask of Light diverged from expectations is its action scenes, or rather a lack thereof. I'm not saying that Mask of Light lacks action scenes, it certainly has them, but more so that the action scenes aren't the point. Yes, there are many action scenes, but ultimately they are more of a set dressing, while the movie is mostly the characters wandering from place to place and trying to find Toa. Sometimes an obstacle shows up, but the answer is more so the characters running away or finding a way to hinder the obstacle, rather than directly fighting them. Direct fighting is actually avoided, for the most part. There are parts where the characters fight, most notably the Toa, fighting off against the Rakshi, but even then, that isn't that violent. Of course, we couldn't forget the most notable example of this, the infamous final fight, being basically a glorified game of lacrosse. I feel this lack of violence is most likely a result of LEGO's mandates. One key mandate LEGO has is trying to avoid violence as much as they can due to not wanting to give bad influence for the kids. But for what it's worth, I think that it works well. The action scenes, while not the most actiony, are fine. And I do like them. While there are many of them, they aren't ultimately what the movie is about. Instead, the movie is about the journey and characters, as well as showing off the locations and characters. One thing about the movie I noticed as an adult is how in many ways its status as a toy commercial really shows. What I mean by this is that in many ways the movie feels like this best of hits compilation. Look, here are the Toa, look, here are the Matoran, here are the Tuaraga, here are Raki, here is the main villain Makuta. It feels like this is very much a slamfest of these cameos and ideas. Don't get me wrong, there is a story here. There are characters with character arcs and relationships and emotional beats. And for what it's worth, Gilroy and the other writers did do a good job on characterizing the characters. But at the same time, there is this feeling, how commercial this feels, how this feels like the celebration of the brand, the world of characters. Ultimately, this doesn't ruin the movie, but it's something that can bother someone, especially an adult. But then again, this movie was made for kids, and I feel that most kids don't really mind this. I know that when I was a kid, I didn't really mind the commercialness. If anything, I didn't notice it. And this tells me that while yes, the toy commercial aspect is clearly present, especially if you're an adult, if you're a kid, you would notice you're too immersed in the story, in the characters. You want to know what happens to Taku and Jeller, who is the seventh Toa. So it doesn't really bother a kid. Now that we talk about the movie itself, let's move on to talk about the characters, their arc, and the general purpose they serve in the story from a narrative and thematic standpoint. The movie has three central characters: the protagonist Takua, his best friend and companion Jalar, and the main villain Makuta. It has other characters with varying levels of importance, but they mostly play a supporting role. As such, I will talk about the three major characters first in depth, before going into the supporting characters much shorter extent. Many of these characters are tied to each other, so as such, I may talk about the characters later on. Let's start with our protagonist, Takua. Takua has a typical arc for a protagonist in a children's movie of finding himself and his place in the world. However, the arc is handled a bit differently compared to the usual. Usually, these types of arcs are all about the protagonist learning to accept themselves, proving themselves to the society by using their strengths to save the day. But Takua's arc goes a bit differently. Instead of the usual song and dance of learning to accept yourself in spite of what the others say and show to the society that people outside of typical norms can do good things for the greater community, Takua has to learn to accept his own unique responsibility and the place the society has given to him. You see, Takua is actually the seventh Toa. Spoilers for a 20-year-old children's movie, by the way. What's next? Makuda's name isn't actually Makuda. The Great Spirit Agent Metanui is actually a... Okay, you know what? That's an actual spoiler. I shouldn't go into that. Moving on, back to Takua. Rather than a literal search for seven Toa, Takua's journey is to find the Toa within and accept his destiny. Throughout the movie, Takua doubts himself, doubts his purpose, whether he's good enough, whether he really should do this. Takua feels that the responsibility of finding the seven Toa isn't something he was meant to do, that it belongs to someone else, someone more competent and better. Why is he the one shouldering the responsibility when he's just a goofball? Why him?
Eventually, Takua realizes that he is the only person to do it, that he is the one meant to save the day, and so he does it. He becomes the seventh Toa Takanuma and becomes the hero to defeat Makuda. Now, one could argue that this type of narrative is somewhat harmful. After all, it does have this idea that Takua was meant to be this special person, rather than him being more just as himself. I feel that that's a rather pessimistic way in looking at things. Ultimately, Takua's arc isn't as much of forcing him into this role as much as him realizing that he was a hero all along, that all this time he possessed the potential of being a hero. Takua's arc isn't about assimilation and forcing to one's role rather than accepting the role within. I understand why someone would come with negatively, but I don't think that was the intention. More so, learning to trust what was there all along. As an arc, Takua's arc is well done. He starts in one place and ends in another. And throughout the movie, we see Takua slowly learning to accept himself, slowly progressing to the endpoint of his arc. It is easy to understand, this is a kid's movie after all, but it's still a compelling arc nonetheless. One interesting note of Takua's character that doesn't tie into his arc, but I still want to bring up, is the way how Takua's character was changed, or rather, how Takua was given more personality. In the material made by Templar Studios, Takua was little more than an audience surrogate character. He didn't really have that much of concrete characterization beyond being a brave and mature and willing to jump on an adventure at the first occasion. Meanwhile, in Mask of Light, Takua was given a proper personality. He is a curiosity and a desire of discovery, but also with doubts and questioning himself. Now, I'm not one of those people who prefer a character with a proper personality over a blank slate audience surrogate. Audience surrogate characters do serve their purpose, and are just a good way of executing a protagonist as actual character protagonist. But in Takua's case, I do believe that his portrayal in Mask of Light is better than his portrayal in other material. This is largely because Takua becomes a much more interesting character than he is given actual character. Takua in Monog functions well as the audience insert, and one of the reasons Monog is good is because of the way how the game uses Takua as the player perspective. But Mask of Light's portrayal of Takua is so vibrant and full of life that the original version pales in comparison. I know that some people don't like how Takua in the movie constantly doubts himself, as this clashes with his original portrayal. But for myself, I'm fine with that. Takua needed a concrete arc, so if he has these self-doubts, well, that's fine. Out of character moments be damned. I also feel that Takua in Mask of Light is more relatable, especially for outsiders like neurodivergent or queer people.
Many people belonging in those groups have expressed how much they relate to Takua, and it's easy to see why. It is rather funny how Takua became much more relatable when he was given an actual personality and characterization to relate to, than just being a blank slate with minimal characterization for the audience to protect you. Once again, this isn't inherently a better writing decision, but for Takua, it's certainly an upgrade. All in all, Takua is a great protagonist. He has a well-written arc that's easy to follow for the kids, but also engaging for the adults. His arc is relatable to many and teaches a very valuable lesson, that even if you doubt yourself and your skills, you still have potential to be a hero.
But in order to continue to talk about Takua's arc in depth, we need to move away from Takua and instead talk about his companion and the other main character of the movie, that being Jolar. Jolar is the movie's protagonist, but he doesn't have an arc of his own. Instead, Jolar's main purpose is to have a character to pair up with Takua. This is multiple usages. Jolar is largely used to have a character Takua can bounce off from, as the two banter a lot throughout the movie, which is used to give levity and characterization rather than having it passively from one plot point to the next. And it worked. The two have a lot of chemistry with each other, which is elevated by the actors' performances. But Jolar serves a deeper purpose than for Takua to have someone to play off with. From a narrative standpoint, Jolar serves as a foil to Takua, which is important for the latter's arc to function. Jolar is everything Takua is not. Jolar is responsible, serious, and driven by duty. Takua is the scareheaded goof who'd rather go explore on his own rather than doing responsibilities expected from him. Jolar is stubborn and rigid, wanting to go do things by the books rather than to improvise and go along, unlike Takua who functions on his instinct rather than logic. Takua doesn't really fit into societal roles or have any purpose, unlike Jolar, who serves as the captain of the guard. Sure, Takua is the chronicler, but even then, that was a job created for him specifically in order to keep him somewhat grounded, rather than an actual job he inherited. For Jolar, finding the seventh Toa is of the utmost importance due to how it's their job to find them. Therefore, it is the most important thing for Metanui, both the island and the god, to be saved from Makuta. Not to mention how their threat of the Rakshi makes this task even more urgent. Takua, meanwhile, isn't as driven by the mission. If anything, he is more uncertain if he was the right person for the role, that someone else should have taken his place, someone like Jolar. Listing all these traits, you start to notice a pattern. Jolar has a lot of traits traditionally associated with heroism. He's responsible, duty-driven, and wants to do the right thing. He prioritizes his people, values honestly, and is willing to sacrifice himself if it's for the greater good. To Jolar, he is second to his people, and his people always come first. Takua, meanwhile, doesn't have these traits. His traits are more that of a quirky sidekick, not a traditional hero. If you told someone who doesn't know Bionicle's story a surface-level description of Takua and Jolar's character traits and asked them to determine who is the more heroic of the two, they'd probably say Jolar. Not that Takua is any less heroic. He has done courageous things both in the movie and the larger story up until this point, but you'd never know that from simply listening to their traits. This is exactly why Jolar is such an important part of Takua's character arc. Jolar is the epitome of what a hero looks and acts like. Takua isn't, but more importantly, Jolar is self-asserting himself, willing to do the right thing no matter the cost. Takua is uncertain and struggles with the burden of responsibility. This is why Jolar cannot be the hero. As stated in Takua's section, the big arc of Mask of Light is Takua coming to terms with his doubts and accepting responsibility as a Toa. Everything in the movie acts as one huge mental test, a hurdle for Takua to overcome in order to accept his responsibility as a hero. Jolar wouldn't need to overcome the same challenges Takua has to overcome. If Jolar was truly a herald like Takua tried to claim, he would have admitted it right away and went to the mission with pride rather than pinning the responsibility on someone else. Jolar would have never run away, instead accepting his duty and destiny of becoming the seventh Toa. Jolar wouldn't have needed to go on this soul-searching road trip across Makaranui because none of the challenges he and Takua came across were challenges he needed to overcome. The journey was specifically made for Takua, not Jolar. At the same time, Takua couldn't have done it alone. He needed someone to believe in him. someone to push him to the right direction, someone to tell him to do the right thing. And that someone was Joller. Without Joller's help and support, Takua would have run away. He wouldn't have accepted the responsibilities hadn't Joller took him along. He wouldn't have faced his fears weren't it for Joller. Takua needed a push to understand what he needed to do, to overcome his fears and doubts and starting to believe in himself. And Joller was the push, both throughout the movie itself, but especially in his death. Joller's last words in his death were what Takua needed to hear to accept the responsibility as a herald, no, as a Toa, a hero. And this is why Joller is important to Takua's character arc. While Takua has to come to the realization himself, he couldn't have done it alone. He needed someone, and that was Joller. He may not have had an arc on his own, but that's alright. Not every character needs an arc. Sometimes you can have characters that help others with their arcs. That's good, right? And this is why Joller is important to Takua's character arc.
And then there's our main villain, Makuta. And oh boy, do I have a lot to say about Makuta. If you have spent any time in the community for the past decade, you most likely are aware of the commonly held narrative that Makuta in Mask of Light is a drastically different take on the character compared to both what came before and after. Many fans have pointed out how the movie's characterization of Makuta has some weird oddities, some quirks that don't really add up when compared to how he is portrayed in the rest of the franchise. In particular, there's a weird exchange between Takanuwa and Makuta during their final confrontation at the climax of the movie that has some weird implications about Makuta's motives that don't really get followed up on in the later stories. After Takanuwa has laid his seemingly decisive strike against Master of Shadows, Makuta rises up, saying that he's protecting Metanui. Takanuwa asks what he means by this, to which Makuta responds with perhaps the most infamous line in the entire movie.
Sleep spares him pain. Awake, he suffers.
Takanuwa then angrily retorts that Makuta isn't protecting the Great Spirit, to which Makuta responds to that his duty is to the Mask of Shadows. This exchange, along with some other oddities in how Makuta is portrayed in Mask of Light and how the story in general is framed, has led many fans to see the movie's take on Makuta as the sympathetic if not outright tragic villain, one whose actions are not out of malice or thirst for power, but rather because he believes he's doing it for the greater good, one who grudgefully carries the burden of protecting his brother, doing the atrocities because that's what's keeping his brother safe. To Makuta, Metanui waking up would be worse than him staying asleep, and as such, the Great Spirit must stay asleep no matter the cost. No matter how much atrocities Makuta has to do, that's better than whatever would happen if his brother woke up. For many fans, this take on Makuta is the most interesting, and the most compelling, and the most fascinating the character ever has been. Many see Mask of Light as arguably the only time Makuta was given any depth or nuance. The only time he has an actual motivation that doesn't boil down to simple jealousy or god complex. Instead, Makuta has motivations that humanize him. Makuta is, if not sympathetic, at the very least understandable. We can see where he's coming from, why he's doing all these atrocities throughout the series up until this point. To us, Makuta is the villain, but to Makuta himself, he's the hero, the guardian keeping Metanui safe from any potential danger. But in all honesty, I have mixed feelings on the whole. Makuta in Mask of Light is a tragic, sympathetic villain and does the best take on the character narrative. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's bad to take a seemingly pure evil villain and portray them in a more sympathetic light. I know there is a lot of discourse on whether or not humanizing villains is a good writing decision, both from a moralistic standpoint because some people think it's not a good thing to give bad people depth due to how that would delegitimize their victims, but also from a narrative standpoint. A lot of people are getting sick and tired of every story these days trying to give some depth or humanity to their villains, and miss the times when a villain could simply be just nasty and fun with no deeper motivation like in the older Disney movies. And while I can sympathize with people missing these fun, simpler villains, that's not really where I'm coming from. While it certainly has been overdone at this point, I'm not inherently opposed to humanizing villains myself. If anything, personally I am rather fond of it. Many of my favorite characters tend to be villains, and I often find myself thinking about them in a much more sympathetic light than they were meant to in their original source material. In Bionicle, I tend to imagine villains such as the Dark Hunters or the Baraki more complexly, giving them much more needed depth and humanity they mostly lacked in canon. And as of media outside of Bionicle, well, let's just say that for the past 3.5 years, I have been hyper-fixated on woobifying a certain one-dimensional evil sorcerer from a Fire Emblem game of all things, and just leave it at that. So, I get it. I really get it. There is something special in noticing hidden details of a seemingly one-note villain. The layers of characterization hidden beneath a typical villain facade. It's rewarding to find all these hidden little details. And just as much it's frustrating when the canon doesn't do anything with them. When it doesn't explore these ideas and concepts to its fullest, and worse, ignores them. Pretends that they don't exist and that the villain was always this one-dimensional bad guy who was evil for the evil's sake. I've been there, so I very strongly sympathize with this mindset. And for Makuta, I do think the narrative of him being a sympathetic villain is an interesting one. Like I presented, the interpretation does give him rather interesting layers that make him a far more complex character than he was before. Makuta was presented as this relatively simplistic character, less of a character and more force of nature, so Mask of Light gave him some depth. I know that everyone loves to talk about the 2 lines Makuta says during his confrontation with Takanuva, but for myself, the lines that I am particularly fond of are his monologues when he unleashes the Rakshi. This is because these monologues show Makuta having a regretful side. He isn't happy in doing this. He doesn't really want to do. But instead, he sees it as his responsibility, his duty, the right thing to do. This makes his character have a lot of conflict and nuance that just give him so much of depth and intrigue. Not only that, but unlike the other scenes, these monologues are Makuta saying to himself. While the other scenes can be justified in Makuta just bullshitting his foes, his monologues? Not so much. Yeah, you could argue that Makuta is lying to himself, but if that's the case, then he wants to believe in a cause. That means that he has a conflict between himself and his desires, that he knows that what he's doing is wrong, but he can't accept it, so he tries to justify it. And that's depth. Real interesting depth. So I understand. There is a lot of interesting aspects in Makuta's character here. I understand why so many people are so fond of this interpretation. My issues with the whole Makuta as a sympathetic villain narrative lie less in it being a bad interpretation in and of itself, and more so how it colors the discussions surrounding the character in the movie. This narrative has gained a life on its own to the point that it isn't really just about Makuta having more complex motivations or tragic depth which gives him humanity. Instead, it has warped itself into being about how Bob Thompson originally planned Makuta to be this tortured little soul who wasn't really evil and simply did bad things to protect his brother. But then the later stories written by Greg Farshtey, the author of most Bionicle novels, decided to retcon Makuta into this overcunning, fight-chasing mastermind of a villain who spits on everything Bob wanted his character to be. Some people even go as far as to claim that originally Makuta wasn't meant to be at fault of his actions, and instead everything was actually his mask's fault. All because of the one line of his duty being to the Mask of Shadows. And this idea of Makuta being originally a much more sympathetic character who wasn't really at fault of his actions isn't simply true. We know that Makuta was originally meant to be a mixture of a satanic archetype and an elder abomination, and Bob's idea of Makuta came much later. But even if we look at just Bob's interpretation of Makuta, Bob never intended Makuta to be this poor little meow meow who never did anything wrong in his life. If anything, that's pretty much the opposite. According to Bob Thompson, Makuta was more so similar to someone like Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, a rough and tough, well-intended extremist who has good intentions, but the way he goes around them are questionable. He was always meant to be this shady character, just one with understandable motivations and reasonings. So the way how some fans have come as far as to remove his agency and still claim that this was Bob's intention feels really disrespectful. It's okay if you like the idea that Makuta being secretly possessed by his mask, but based on what we know, that was never the intention. Bob's Makuta was tragic, but he had agency. He was responsible for his actions. And sometimes we forget that. We just treat Makuta as this poor, misunderstood victim that we forget that he is still a villain. But what's even more frustrating with this narrative is that this is all people talk about when it comes to Makuta. The only thing that people talk about Makuta in Mask of Light is the idea that he was this misunderstood tragic villain. And here's the thing. That's not all Makuta is in this movie. Yeah, it's interesting to talk about how Makuta may or may not have originally been a bit more complex character than we ended up getting, but Makuta is still a villain. The main purpose he has in the narrative is to oppose the protagonists and the world at large. And I feel that this aspect of the character often gets lost. Sure, one could argue that Makuta in Mask of Light isn't really the most well-written villain. That most of the time he just sends his minions to do the dirty work for him and waits in his lair till Takanuba shows up and fights him. But while that statement does have truth to it, to say that that's all Makuta does is doing a vast disservice for Makuta in this movie. Sure, for the most part Makuta lets the Rakshi do the dirty work for him, but I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. Partially because Makuta does other things in the movie, most notably when he tries to manipulate Takua of giving up his quest, which is one of the best parts of the movie. The way how he tries to convince Takua that the quest isn't worth doing is so chilling. He preys on his weakness, he tries to make sure that he doesn't fulfill his destiny, and that's compelling, it's chilling. Also partially because I do like what Makuta does with the Rakshi. I do feel that Rakshi in a sense are an extension to Makuta. They aren't as much their own characters or even typical Mook minions that the Big Bad sends. They are just as much of Makuta as Makuta himself. Makuta represents corruption. He represents this corroding element, the corrosion of the island, the destruction and cruelty. And Rakshi are just that. The Rakshi are literally pieces of Makuta that he rips out of himself, that he makes. If that isn't a sign that the Rakshi aren't just another set of minions, but instead an extension to Makuta as a villain, I don't know what is. And if we take this into account, Makuta becomes a much more active and proactive presence in the movie. Makuta is the darkness, he is the corruption. He represents everything that Toa and Matoran are fighting against, what they are protecting the Matoran from. He is the shadow that's lurking. The Rakshi corrupt, they corrode, they are Makuta's messengers that bring the destruction with them. And when you take that into account, combine the Rakshi with Makuta's active presence, you get a pretty solid villain. One whose presence is the antithesis of the themes. If the story is about courage and Takua accepting himself and learning to take courage and determination, Makuta is the fear. He represents the insecurities. He is one way the movie concretizes its themes. One way it simplifies its ideas to the kids. And I feel sad that we don't talk about this aspect of Makuta so much in the community. Because this is what makes him a great villain in this movie. Not the depth or implied sympathetic aspects, though, as said, they are genuinely interesting, but how he opposes the heroes, what he represents in the movie and its themes. That's what makes Makuta great.
And
And as for the supporting characters, well, they are fine enough. While as said, the two are really aren't the focus of the movie, they still play a pivotal role in its action scenes and have a subplot on their own. The Toa mainly show up once in a neat little scene like a cameo, but even then, they still do feel relatively in character. Their voice acting does a lot of job in portraying their characters. Liba being really the one exception, as his voice doesn't really fit the character at all.
Angora, just doing her duty. If this was your home realm, you'd do the same.
The only two Toa that get notable screen time are Tahu and Gali, unsurprisingly. Tahu is the closest to having a proper arc, as he gets corrupted by a Lyrock. This is a reflection to his impulsivity, as well as how he and the other Toas struggle maintaining their teamwork together. Gali, meanwhile, mainly acts as exposition or emotional support. She doesn't really have an arc, she mainly is there to act as the mediator for the other Toa, to be the first Toa to notice the Rakshi and warning the others, as well as to trying to help Tahu. As for the other supporting characters, they're fine too. The two notable ones are Holly and Turaga Wakama, the former having brief interactions with Joller and Takua, and the later being the mentor that sends them on this quest to begin with. Their characterization is neat, and their voice acting helps as well. Special notes for, first of all, Lee Gaze's brilliant performance as Wakama.
In the mask. Let it be your guide.
One interesting note is that Holly was meant to be a tritagonist at one point, but her role was reduced due to it taking a lot of screen time from an already packed movie, which, while unfortunate, is understandable.
So all in all, the cast is great. Yeah, they are really written for a kids movie, but they will do their purpose as well and help to explore the ideas of heroism, of taking responsibility, and accepting your role of becoming a hero. Every character plays their part well, while certain characters may not have been the most accurately portrayed and some get more screen time than others. Most of the characters are still important in the grand scheme of things and still feel like themselves, with one notable exception.
Mask of Light has an interesting legacy surrounding it, as the movie is placed between two eras. Bionicle is a series that changed its form and cause over its 10-year run, and Mask of Light falls right in the middle of this. The initial 3 years were far more lighthearted, focusing on hunting the MacGuffins and fighting the villains. Meanwhile, the later arcs are more so focused on telling a larger, overarching story. The stakes became more dire, the villains more cruel. And Mask of Light sits right in the middle of this. The movie feels like a weird time capsule. In a way, it feels like an end of an era. It feels like the last hurrah of the original 3 years of that simpler time when Bionicle's story was mostly a backdrop for the kids' play. But at the same time, Mask of Light does feel like the start of a new beginning. While yes, Mask of Light does share a lot of similarities with the first 2 years, it also feels a bit different. The first 2 years were all intents and purposes not really that story-driven. At this point, the only avenues to the story were the works of Central Studios, such as the Matanui online game or the Bulwark animations, as well as the comics. The books first started to become a thing in 2003. As such, the first 2 years were less focused on the story as an actual narrative and more so focused on giving a backdrop for the kids to play, come up with their own stories. Mask of Light was the turning point, where Bionicle's story went from being a simple backdrop for the kids' imaginations into an actual story, as the later years were filled with plot and stories in different places to the point of an annoyance. Mask of Light, along with the novels written by Kakti Hapka, were really the first time Bionicle's story was put on forefront, rather than being a springboard. But even then, Mask of Light's tone feels drastically different from anything else. Yes, it is silly and lighthearted, Its relatively simplistic and fun tone is drastically different from the other two movies, which were far more serious. Sure, Mask of Light does have its own share of serious moments, but nowhere compared to the other two. And this element of turning points is all over the movie. The movie is the turning point of the larger Bionicle narrative, both in terms of story, focus, and tone. This was the last time we went to the island of Matanui. The last time with a relatively clear-cut, simple story. This was the first time the stakes got really big and strong and bold. It's a turning point in other ways too. Takua's character arc is a turning point in his role of being a supporting character to a hero. This was the turning point of how Toa were portrayed, as this was the last time that Toa would struggle with their teamwork, a plot point that was presented many times before. This was the turning point of Makuta's characterization, and from a meta standpoint, it was a turning point to LEGO too. As many know, LEGO in early 2000s was close to bankruptcy, and Bionicle was the thing that saved LEGO from it. So, ultimately, while Mask of Light is certainly a movie about courage and growth and learning to accept responsibility, it's also a movie about turning points, about something ending, another thing beginning. It's a turning point both in the terms of the story, the narrative and themes of it, and LEGO as a whole. And that's what makes it really interesting for me. At the end of the day, you can really feel the movie being aimed at kids. But in spite of that, it's still a genuinely fun movie with a genuinely good life lesson to it. While I'm not as obsessed with the movie as I used to be, I can still see why I fell in love with it all these years ago, why it meant so much to me, and why it became my favorite movie as a child. So, I really hope you enjoyed my look back at Mask of Light. I am the Arcanist, and this is the way of Bion.